Hello. Today, in this video, I want to talk a little bit about continued expansion of population from the eastern part of the United States to the western part of the United States. And I thought it would make sense to start this conversation with a video. It seems like westward expansion is a constant theme in this course, and it really is. As we talk about the course before the Civil War, we're talking about how westward expansion and expansion into Kansas and Nebraska and so on and so forth is causing debates over the institution of slavery. Well, the westward expansion of the United States does not end with the Civil War. It continues. And if we look at this map, we can see a visual depiction of changes in population over time. So it shows you that in the decades after the Civil War, in the areas that are yellow, you have more than a doubling of population. Says between 1880 and 1890. So in 10 years, you have more than a doubling of population in these western territories. These green areas, they're growing between 25 and 100% in population, and these blue areas are still increasing in population by 25%. So we can see an enormous movement of population from these parts of the country. Even these pink areas have a decrease in population, and they're moving out to the west. And what is drawing Americans to do that, and what consequences is that going to have on American society, on American economy? Also, we should not overlook what impact is it going to have on Native Americans? That's going to be a big part of our discussion as well. If we look at this map, we can see geographically a part of the United States that for a time was considered the Great American Desert. This was the Great Plains, and people didn't really, in the early 1800s, see it as all that productive. And for what we think of it today as area for large farms, that really wasn't developed until new farming techniques came along and made large farms and bonanza farms more profitable. And then all of a sudden, this land in the Great Plains became much more desirable for people. And so there was a desire to move west and settle and take, I suppose would be the way to describe this land from Native Americans that were already there. Now, I have my favorite train on the left. This is Thomas, and he represents the fact that a big part of expansion is railroads. And we'll talk about that, and we'll also mention how farming plays a significant role in that as well. So hopefully these images just lighten the mood a little bit. And so when we talk about railroads as playing a significant role in expansion, railroads as an industry was only born in the early 1800s. And now that we're in the mid and into the late 1800s, it is an enormous business. So there's huge amounts of money to be made, and it can fundamentally change how Americans interact with one another, how the economy works. So there's a whole lot going on with regards to railroads. And you can see from this map that the black lines show railroads that were in operation in 1870, and the red lines show railroads that were built between 1870 and 1890. So you can see an obvious growth in the railroad network of the United States, and notably a significant connection between the East Coast and the West Coast. So that's the next thing I wanted to talk about, is the creation of the Transcontinental Railroad, which actually was something that Abraham Lincoln pushed for in the middle of the Civil War. He signed a bill that in effect said that land is going to be basically given to railroad companies, to two separate railroad companies, and one is going to build a railroad from the West Coast to the East Coast, and the other is going to build a railroad from the Midwest of the United States, because we already have a railroad on the East Coast, and that's going to move west. And both railroads had an enormous incentive to go as quickly as they could, because the more railroad they were able to build, the more land they were able to get from the federal government, in essence, just given to them in order to build this railroad, because the government had a huge interest in connecting East and West. And now a form of transportation that is much faster, much safer, and much more reliable exists to get from the Midwest, which was populated, and the West Coast, which was populated by Americans living in United States states. So the Transcontinental Railroad is a really important part of U.S. history, and it's also an example of how the government plays a role in trying to spur the private businesses and the economy by incentivizing certain behaviors. Now, this is a famous picture of the meeting of the two railroad lines at a place called Promontory Point, Utah. And we're going to look at this a little bit closer in class. But one of the things that is notable, we should mention right off the bat, is that some of the people, and in fact, large amounts of the people who are not in this visual are laborers who were the ones who were actually doing the building. And on the West Coast side, at least, a significant amount of the labor for the Transcontinental Railroad came from Chinese immigrants. And they were treated very poorly. They were underpaid. And as we move forward in our course this year and start to talk about the demographic shifts and the rise of immigration and anti-immigrant sentiment from different parts of the world, we'll talk a little bit more about what drew people to come to the United States and then what happened when they got here, and perhaps how they were not treated on an equal footing with those who were already here. So that's a bit of an overview of some of the things we'll discuss in class. It's really quick stuff, and in class we're going to look at a couple of documents that I think are interesting, and we're going to look at some visuals that I think are interesting as well. Thanks very much for watching and for listening.